continue our series on fire pit. No fires, as you've noticed, so we're staying warm in here. Actually, I think it's pretty good. Tonight we continue looking at people who have inspired us, and I guess this person has inspired me. Tonight we're looking at the story of Corrie Ten Boom, or Corrie Ten Boom, and she lived in Holland during World War I and II period, and she was pretty average, to be honest. The first 45 to 50 years of her life, she was very average. I think I've got a picture of her on the screen there, and that was in her early years, when she lived with her sister and her father in a little 3-story house in Haarlem, just outside of Amsterdam. Now, she was the first watchmaker, woman watchmaker in all of Holland at the time. Quite a remarkable woman in some ways, but also very ordinary. She lived in this tiny little 3-bedroom house. The bottom story was the watch shop, so they lived on the top 2 stories, and she became a watchmaker, worked with her father and her sister making watches for the first 45 years of her life until World War II happened. And during World War II, I guess that's really what inspires me, is what she did during World War II. And we're going to talk a little bit about that tonight. Has anyone heard of Corrie Ten Boom before? Oh, see, lots of you had. So she's a bit more famous than the guy I spoke about last week, Lee Tournay. And I guess she's famous for some of the books she's written as well as what she's done. So I read one of her autobiographies this week as I was looking at exploring a little bit more deeply what motivated her, how her life was transformed by God. And hopefully we'll hear a little bit more about her tonight. But if you want to read up about her, you can go to The Secret Hiding Place, which is this book on the screen. So I just read that one this week, and it's her autobiography up to before later years in life. So the story of how she grew up and then how she ended up smuggling out Jewish people in Holland during World War II. But we'll get to that. So as I said, she lived in Holland, and I think I've got a picture of her little 3-story house. So it's still there. You can actually go visit it today. It's now a museum to Corrie Ten Boom and her family and all that they did. But yeah, as I said, it's a tiny little house. So her bedroom was in the top story. So that small window up the top there is where she lived. I think it was at the back of the house. And then the watch shop was at the bottom. And there's a side door as well as the front door, which is important because a lot of the people she used to smuggle out of that place came to the side door. So they would knock at the side door and she'd bring them into the house. But as I said, her first 50 years of her life was just so normal. It was so average, which is really interesting in the day and age that we find ourselves living in, where no one wants to be average anymore. To make it in this world, you've got to be extraordinary at something to get enough YouTube followers or to have enough friends on Instagram or whatever it might be. The world doesn't want ordinary anymore. The world we find ourselves in doesn't want ordinary. Yet that really is the story of her life. She was just ordinary. She never married, never had any relationships her entire life. She did not have a relationship, but she was interested in a man early on in her life, in her early 20s, and that fell through. He was from a wealthier family, and they had decided he should marry someone of better status. So they were together for a couple of months, and then he never saw her again until much later on when he was married. And that hit her pretty hard, actually. If you've been interested in someone before and turned out they weren't interested in you, it can be quite heartbreaking. And she recalls praying a prayer like this in her book. She says, "Lord, I give you the way I feel about Carol." That was the guy. "My thoughts about our future, oh, you know, everything. Give me your way of seeing Carol instead. Help me to love him that way, that much." And after praying that prayer, she found that God really did give her the strength to love him and see him the way that God did. And I think we're going to look at being single a bit later on in the year. But I think praying a prayer like that is so powerful. If you're a single person and you want to have a relationship with someone or you are interested in someone, I think it's a powerful way. And it started off a lot of her journey in terms of just being average. She would give her concerns over to God, and she would discover that he would just give her the power to continue living for him, despite the fact she perhaps didn't have what she wanted, or her life wasn't going the way she envisioned it. And I think it's challenging for each of us. Now, as we come through her life, we get to the mid-1940s, and the Nazi regime out of Germany invaded Holland, as it did most of Europe. And what that meant was that Jewish people became increasingly unsafe in Holland. And she would hear about disappearances because she was running a watch shop, so she would see that customers' watches had been sitting on the pickup hanging space for a long time, and she starts to realise, hang on a sec, people are actually going missing. And that was the first sort of experience she had of persecution against the Jewish people. But it grew from that to people throwing rocks through windows, people being targeted, people being taken off the street. And one time she actually recounts that opposite her shop, the German SS raided a house opposite her house and actually forced this guy out into the street by gunpoint. Left him out there. They went back into the house and threw his belongings, some clothes, through a window in the top story, and left this man standing on the street with just his clothing. Of course, Corrie saw that, rushed over, brought the man in to a house. That was the first person that she rescued and found a safe place to hide. She had family outside of Haarlem, and so she arranged for the guy to be taken out there during the night, and that was the first person that she smuggled out of her town. Now, she recalls that she didn't realise she was working for the underground resistance at this stage, but she asked the question a couple of weeks later, did this guy get there safely? How is it all going? And the reply was, if you're going to work for the underground, Corrie, you must learn not to ask such questions. And that was really she realised, hang on a sec, I'm actually working for the underground resistance against the German regime. And of course, she didn't really see herself as working for the resistance at that stage. She really actually just understood that, well, these people needed help. God loves them. I love them because God loves them. They need help. I'm going to help them. That's really how she understood all of her ministry in her place in terms of smuggling people. She really didn't care too much about the resistance. It was more about actually being God's hands and feet in her town. And of course, word got out that she would care for people, and people would start just rocking up at her doorstep. The army would invade a house, they'd go from door to door, and she would end up with people on her doorstep just with nowhere to go. And so she started smuggling people regularly. She actually became part of the underground resistance, so she ended up being taken off to a secret meeting place, about half an hour's bike ride. She actually used a bike, which is pretty cool. I like bikes. She used to ride out there half an hour once a month, and they would meet up with the resistance. And everyone there was named Mr. Schmidt or Mrs. Schmidt. So there was this whole gathering, which she never knew anybody's names, yet she would gather there with them. And then at one point, someone introduces someone over to her and says, look, we hear about you smuggling all these people. It's not safe for them to just be anywhere in your house. You need a safe place for them to go in case the army raids your house. So we're going to build a safe room in your house. We're going to build a secret room in a house. And I think I might have a picture on the screen. I can't remember if I put that in the notes. Yes, so the underground resistance actually went over to her house and built this room in her bedroom. So they cut off just a little bit at the back of the house, and they actually put bricks up to build a false wall. And that is actually how they got in through the cupboard. So they would crawl through the bottom of the cupboard to hide in there if the place was raided. Because this is on the top floor, so they had to give themselves enough time to get in there. And they used to practice drills for the people that were staying in her house to get inside that room. And it can hold about 6 people standing upright with their back against the wall. The hole in the wall has been put in there so that if you go and visit the house, which you can do, you can actually see what it's like. You can go in there and stand in there yourself. There's just enough room for 6 people and some water and food. But yeah, it's quite interesting what they actually did in that place. Now, the Germans never actually found that room. It was kept secret. And she used to have 6 or 7 people staying permanently in her house at this stage when the room was built. And these people were considered too dangerous to go and be hid somewhere else, in someone else's house. So one of the men apparently would look too much like a Jew. no matter where he would be recognised as a Jew. I guess that's by his facial features, I'm not sure. And then there was a bunch of other people. There was an old lady that she housed in her house, and her breathing was so heavy and laboured that it was too loud, so she wouldn't actually be able to hide anywhere else. Everyone was afraid to take her in. But not Corrie. She was like, no, this person needs help, so you can stay with me. And all the people that she housed were like that. No one else wanted them. No one else wanted to smuggle them. No one else wanted to keep them safe. So she did. She ended up with 6 other people living in her house. So a house that should have only had 3 people actually had 9 people. So you can imagine that in order to practice moving into the safe room, you've also got to think about, all your bedding, you've got to take that with you, because supposedly there's not more people staying in the house. Or if you're eating, you've got to take your food and your plates with you as well, because there's evidence. If you were smoking, you'd have to take your ashtray with you. So that this is the sort of the thing that the army would look for when they're searching a house. They would look for all this evidence of someone else there. They'd have to flip the mattresses over, because the SS would come in and they'd feel the mattresses to see if they were warm, and so they would know if someone was staying there. It's quite incredible what they did to try and smuggle people and keep them safe during this wartime period. Now, one of the things that really impacted me about reading her story was an experience that Corrie tells a little bit before she got into all this smuggling of people and keeping them safe. She would go and deliver watches to people to Jewish people who were too afraid to come out into town to collect them. So she'd start delivering them, hand delivering them to the house. And at one point she was meeting with a family, Mr. and Mrs. Heemstra, and she was sitting having tea, as you do when you deliver a watch by hand. You sit and have tea and chat. It's a customary thing to do. But she heard this little voice pipe around the corner, and it said, "Daddy, you didn't tuck us in." And it was their kids. It must have been bedtime. And so the dad jumped up and ran upstairs, and you could hear them playing. And it was in that moment, sometimes you just have moments where you're like, wow. You stop and you think, wow, this is something that I should take notice of. And this was a moment for Corrie. The reason it stopped her in her tracks was because at any moment the army could come in and take these people away and leave these kids by themselves. And it was in that moment that she felt herself praying right there and then as she was sitting down. She was like, "Lord Jesus, I offer myself for your people in any way, any place, any time." That moment got to her. The Holy Spirit spoke and she responded. Any way, any place, any time. And that's really what catapulted her into caring actively for people, not just having them rock up at a doorstep, but actually putting the word out, "Yes, come to me. I'll look after you." She really offered her whole life in any way for God to use her in caring and showing love to those around her. And that is, I found a challenge as I read what she'd written, as I'd read what she'd done. Such a dangerous prayer, isn't it? To pray that. Any place, any time, anywhere. Just use me. And that's a challenge for all of us, I think, in whatever stage of life you're in. To pray a prayer like that and to lay down your life before God and say, "Yeah, just use me, however you want. I don't mind. I don't care. Just use my life in a significant way." Which, coming from her life being so, I would say, average, almost insignificant, leading up to this point, I don't think it was insignificant. I think God had been preparing her life up to this point in teaching her how to love people. That when it came to actually being able to put that into practice, she had everything already there to do that. Her relationship with God. Now, I would say that as Corrie continued to do this, she understood she was in a dangerous place. And word got out in many different areas. Even the police heard about her endeavours in keeping people safe. And they actually had some sympathy. She had some people high up in the police force in Holland that actually sympathised with her. They couldn't necessarily do anything about it because they weren't in charge, the Germans were. But she grew friends in many different places. And of course, as you become more famous, you also attract attention the wrong way. And so she had a number of people that tried to betray her. And eventually she was raided by the German army and taken away, along with her father and her sister. And she later found out that it was someone that knew them quite well, that had betrayed them to the Germans. But what was remarkable is they never actually found the safe room. So they searched and searched through the whole house, were never able to find it. They stationed a guard outside the house for 3 or 4 days, and then they left it, thinking there wouldn't be anyone in there. But the people that she hid actually stayed safe. And I thought that was quite remarkable, because later on in her life, Corrie actually writes a letter to the person that betrayed her, and actually said, I actually forgive you for what you've done. Now, that betrayal actually cost the life of her sister and her father. Her father died 10 days after he was taken, and her sister passed away in the Ravensbrück concentration camp due to illness. And her sister were taken there and spent many months there at that concentration camp. And if you read the book, it's just incredible, some of the situations they found themselves in. But all through that period of time, her faith with Jesus was strong. It never wavered once. And she was actually released due to a clerical issue, error. So she was actually released from the concentration camp early, only to discover that a week or two after her release, the women in the camp of her age were actually sent to the gas chambers. Yet somehow she escaped that fate. Her sister did not, though. Her sister passed away before that point. What I find interesting is her response to that. Now, if you go through some pain, if you go through a painful time, if someone hurts you, you've got two ways in which you can respond. You can either go into a downward spiral of hate and anger, even depression, or you can actually look for God and ask for strength to forgive and to overcome, and for Him to use that experience for His kingdom and His glory. And what is so challenging about Corrie's life is that she doesn't head into a downward spiral of anger and despair. No, that same love that she had cared for the Jewish people during her period in the underground resistance was the same love that she carried on afterwards. And as I said, she wrote a letter to the person that betrayed her. She also spent, after the war finished, she spent a lot of time working with both people in her own hometown that had worked with the Nazis. So if you can imagine, after the war finished, if you worked for the Nazis, you were now totally ostracized. No one wanted to have anything to do with you, or shut off from just about everything. And so she actually decided, what God would do, He'd go and reach out to those people and show them that He loved them, even though they had done something, they betrayed their country and the people in there. And so she went and worked with those people, gave them a home, gave them a rehabilitation place that they could go, and actually discover forgiveness for what they had done. Not only that, but then she also traveled into Germany many times and spoke in gatherings and meetings for anyone who would turn up. Because she discovered that Germany after World War II wasn't just physically bombed out, which it was, destroyed, but also emotionally, spiritually, it was just dead. People needed forgiveness. And so she went in there for years. To whoever would listen, she would preach the love of God. And she recalls that one time she was at a gathering, and after she had spoken, a man comes up and says, "Thank you so much for speaking. I really needed to hear God's love for me, that He actually loves me." And she recognized him. He was one of the people that tortured her at Ravensbrück concentration camp. And she recalls that in that moment, he'd stuck his hand out to shake her hand, and she just couldn't do it and was stuck by her side. You know, she'd just been preaching about forgiveness and God's love, yet here in this situation, she's faced with actually doing it herself. And she recalls praying a prayer. She says, "I cannot forgive him, God. Give your forgiveness." And as she does that, she raises a hand to shake his, and she recalls that as she did that, she felt power of God just zing through her arm into his, down her arm into his hand. And she realized in that moment, it wasn't actually her power, it wasn't actually her forgiveness. It was actually God's forgiveness through her, enabling her to forgive him for what he had done. Such a powerful story. I encourage you to go read it. Because forgiveness is one of those things that's so easy to talk about. It's so easy to stand up here and talk about forgiveness, that God forgives you. It's actually a lot harder to live that out in your life. And I know that's something I have struggled with, is forgiveness. And I found forgiveness isn't just a once-off thing. I found it's a journey of forgiveness. And I know my own heart wants to hold on to pain because it's just easier. It's just easier. If someone hurts you, holding on to it means you don't have to change the way you feel about that person. It means you don't have to change the way you see that person. Yet forgiveness actually enables you to do that when you say, you know what, I actually do forgive you. It releases you. It's also saying, do you know what? God can take care of that situation that maybe wasn't just, that was injustice that happened. And I think that's why forgiveness is hard, is because it means you've actually got to let go of stuff and let God deal with situations. And sometimes we don't see justice this side of eternity. Sometimes it happens the other side of eternity. Yet we see in Matthew 5 verse 45, Jesus says, "You've heard the law that says, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you." And Jesus' challenge here is something I think that Corrie actually lived out. She prayed for those people that persecuted her. And she loved them. And she was only able to do that by the love of God in her, by the power of God working through her. And I think if you're dealing with pain in your life, you can either choose to hold on to it and let it fester, or you can actually give it over to God and say, you deal with that. I release it to you. Perhaps if you're struggling with that tonight, struggling with a painful situation, struggling with being able to forgive somebody, I think Corrie's story, her life, really inspires us to let God work through us, to let God work on us and our own heart in enabling us to forgive those around us that have done wrong to us. Perhaps you're here tonight and you actually need to become more aware of God's love for you. Corrie encountered so many people after World War II that just needed to hear the love of God. People that perhaps had worked for the German army, they just actually need to hear God's love for the first time, for the 100th time. And that moment where Corrie realized what she was called to do. She was called to rescue people who may be taken at any moment from their families. Perhaps you need a moment where you actually realize what God is calling you for. And it's easy when we're busy to actually let those things pass by. But the good news is that God doesn't just let pass by us. He's with us all the time, and He's always wanting to show us how He wants to use you for His kingdom. And that's encouraging. Perhaps you're here for the first time and you've got questions about who Jesus actually is and the impact that He can actually make on your life, as He did on Corrie's. And I'd love to catch up with you. I'd love to chat with you after service and have a coffee sometime during the week even, and chat about what it means to know Jesus. Now, I thought I'd finish tonight by reading some of the words from Romans 12, verse 1 to 2 from the Message translation. And I think we've got that on the screen. I think it's a fantastic challenge as we finish. And Paul says this to the church in Rome. He says, "So here's what I want you to do. God helping you. Take your everyday, ordinary life, your sleeping, eating, going to work, and walking around life, and place it before God as an offering. Embracing what God does for you is the best thing you can do for Him. Don't become so well adjusted to your culture that you fit into it without even thinking. Instead, fix your attention on God. You'll be changed from the inside out. Readily recognize what He wants from you and quickly respond to it. Unlike the culture around you, always dragging you down to its level of immaturity, God brings the best out of you and develops well-formed maturity in you." There's many things that you can take out of Corrie's life, I think. But I think one of the biggest things for me is that God doesn't necessarily need you to be extraordinary for him to use you. He actually just wants your ordinary life to be given for him, to build his kingdom. He doesn't require anything special. He just requires that you love him and that you love others. And you can do extraordinary things for his kingdom. I mean, Corrie did many things for the Jewish people, but she did other things too, not just that. In the years before she was involved in the underground movement, she taught a Sunday school, almost like church, for mentally disabled people. She still loved people that no one else wanted. No one else wanted to have anything to do with. She did that after the war too, working with people that no one else loved. She just loved people. And I think that's the biggest challenge. Sometimes we want to do extraordinary things, but actually God calls us to do the ordinary things. Just to love people around us, extravagantly like he does. So we're going to finish now, and we're going to sing a new song. And I encourage you to reflect on the words of the song, because I think they are powerful. But let's pray as we finish up tonight. Father, just thank you so much that you love us. Father, I pray that none of us would be so busy not to experience your love for us, guiding and leading us as we head out from here. Father, thank you for the life of Corrie. Thank you that just her ordinary life was just inspired by your love, that she saw people that no one else saw. Father, may we be just a little bit like that. May you show us people in our lives that we can love. May you show us ways we can love people that are written off by our society, that we can help build your kingdom one person at a time, just as she did. Father, thank you so much that you want to partner with each and every one of us. None of us are too ordinary. None of us are too broken to be used by you. Thank you so much that you want to partner with all of us, with everyone who would follow you, who would take up their cross and follow you. We thank you so much for that. In Jesus' name, amen.